Let me read to you from Mark 7 today, 1 to 8, a passage where we find great conflict emerging and differences. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. You see, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they don't eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it's written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teaching are merely human rules." You have let go of the commands of God and are holding to human traditions. Jesus finds himself caught up in a conflict with the scribes and the Pharisees. They observed the disciples eating food without ceremonial washing and therefore failing to observe the tradition of the day established by those considered to be the elders, the people who helped to define what the rules actually meant. The response of Jesus Christ concerns what goes into a person as opposed to that which emanates from the human heart. Jesus seems to give scant regard to oral tradition and law. Now, I don't believe that is the case, but you can see how people would easily reach that conclusion when you read this passage. These are not the moral laws of God, is one of the things that Jesus is really driving home for us. He's asking us to be released from that kind of unhealthy, fundamentalist attitude to law. His concern is spiritual transformation. He desires purity of the heart. So what we find in this passage are a number of things that I just remind you of. In verse 7, it's quite clear that Jesus accused the scribes and the Pharisees of vain worship. That's a bit strong, isn't it? Vain worship. Now, he didn't hate Pharisees. He didn't hate scribes. There were many Pharisees that came to him. You remember Nicodemus and other people who were leaders and elders, members of the Sanhedrin that came to him. But he did recognize that there were some problems that they had. They had lost their touch with the commands of God. It tells us in verse 8, quite clearly this truth is there. You've let go of the commands of God. And he's really saying you're keeping hold of human traditions. The commands of God are important. Jesus didn't condemn the commands of God. The 10 Commandments are important to him. The rules were important. But there seems to be a superficiality about such rule keeping. That's why it's important here that we see in verse 5. This is all about washing your hands. Do you know there were hundreds of rules that all related to how you should wash your hands and how you should use cooking utensils? Hundreds of rules. Now that's just a bit over the top. And Jesus knew that that was the case. He wanted to replace that kind of obsessional behavior with rule keeping to something far, far more important. He wanted to replace ritual with righteousness. Now, I think that's really what we find in verses 3 and 4 here, when he's talking about all that they were criticized from when they came in from the marketplace. He wanted to give them something different. And that's what the coming of Jesus does. It doesn't just get rid of things, but it transforms them. It changes them, just as it changes human life. Human life needs to be transformed by the grace of God. The grace of God is what makes the difference. And that difference is a powerful one, and one that will always, always make a difference to the way we live our lives. It's a great thing that Jesus does here. And he also says what really matters is not just what we put into ourselves, that's i.e. rules about eating, about acting, but what comes out of a person's life. Because that really is so very, very important, the way our lives are lived. Jesus knew that that would be true for the disciples. I can't imagine what the disciples were thinking when they listened to Jesus in conversation here, when they saw and observed the conflicts that took place between Jesus and the scribes. Jesus didn't set out to cause conflict, But he certainly was not afraid to raise the issues as the issues appeared, as they emerged in specific circumstances. And, you know, Mark realized that this would need to be explained to some, which is why when you read this passage, you find in brackets the gospel writer explains. Mark is really saying, well, the reason why you need to know this is because of all the rules. Now, Hugh Latimer was one of the great Christian martyrs. He was somebody who served God, and yet he lost his life for serving Jesus Christ. He came to a conclusion, a very significant one in terms of the kind of theme that's emerging here. He said this: we must first be made good before we can do good. We must first be made just before we can please God. And I think that's really one of the powerful messages in this passage, that really, if we're going to live the life of Christ, then it needs to be that the life of Christ is within us and then comes out of our life day by day in the way that we care for others and we live our life of discipleship. First made good before we can do good.